In the days following Fidel Castro's death, many in the American media praised his legacy and spoke of him with a tone of reverence. He was characterized as the George Washington of his country, a national hero, a symbol of the revolution who bravely defied the United States. Purportedly, even his critics praised his advances in healthcare and education, which he provided free for all. And his fellow citizens will remember him fondly, as he is no doubt considered a revolutionary hero in Cuba. That's what they said. It is. Really? You don't believe me?
Well, Fidel Castro was considered, even to this day, the George Washington of his country, among those who remain in Cuba.
By then a declared socialist, he dramatically improved health care and literacy.
And at the same time, a national hero who brought education and medical care to his people.
But gave his people better health care and education.
On the other hand, he rewrote the social contract in Cuba, in a small island nation, in which he put health care, education, culture, and the capacity for Cuba to have an independent foreign policy front and center.
But he is the symbol of the revolution, and is a revolution that has changed with normalization with the United States, with new economic impetus from his brother Raul.
Even Castro's critics praised his advances in healthcare and in education.
Education and healthcare for all, racial integration.
Writers, the arts, that Cuban culture that Chris was so romantic about, no one wants to lose that. It's been so rich and deep-rooted in our country. No one there is going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, you know what, we need Jeffersonian democracy in this island nation.
There is no doubt that he is considered here a revolutionary hero, not only in Cuba, but in many places around the world, and also for his defiance of the United States.
And I think that he will be remembered fondly. Yes, he was a leftist. Yes, he was a communist. Yes, his economic system failed. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, the Cuban medicine is renowned the world over.
Intelligence and shrewdness continued to command fear and respect. He would eventually outlive many of his critics and outlast 10 U.S. administrations.
Pretty disgraceful, huh? But you might say he's, been out of power for 8 years, and perhaps they're just following President Obama's lead and letting history be the judge. Surely if he were still in power, they wouldn't hesitate to denounce him. Right?
For Castro, freedom starts with education. And if literacy alone were the yardstick, Cuba would rank as one of the freest nations on earth.
What did she just say?
If literacy alone were the yardstick, Cuba would rank as one of the freest nations on earth.
What kind of a statement is that? The measure of freedom is not whether or not you can read.
Castro has delivered the most to those who had the least.
The most what? Political prisoners? People forced into exile? Famine?
And for much of the third world, Cuba is actually a model of development. Education was once available to the rich and the well-connected. It is now free to all. Medical care was once for the privileged few. Today, it is available to every Cuban, and it is free.
Mr. Jennings, what do you think it means for something to be free? Do you think healthcare and education just rain down on Cuba like manna from heaven? Here's a secret. The doctors are slaves. The teachers are slaves. The American South used to have free cotton too. Were those plantation owners benevolent heroes?
Was mainly driven by his burning desire to crush Cuba's American-supported dictator, Fulgencio Batista. It began with a daredevil attack on the military barracks, jail, his exile, and then a death-defying 2-year fight in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra. He and his small band of soldiers endured and won only because of Castro's invincible certainty of their destiny.
Down from the mountains, the conqueror comes.
Whoa! Easy there, Diane Sawyer. This isn't Romeo and Juliet in Cuba. Could you be any more in love with the guy?
But the bottom line is every Cuban has a primary care physician.
Cuba may not have the nicest facilities or equipment. Medicine is sometimes in short supply, but...
What? What good is a doctor without medicine? A doctor without medicine is a fucking witch.
Everyone has access, and the concept of paying is completely foreign.
And maybe that's why medicine is in such short supply.
This is the Cuban Revolution's holy land. From these mountains, Castro's guerrilla army took a dream and gave it life, made it known in every village, made it real in every home across Cuba.
And what dream is that, Mr. Rather? The dream of firing squads, gulags, and secret police?
Cuban President Fidel Castro cast his vote in Sunday's national and provincial assembly elections with enthusiasm. No dubious campaign spending here, no mudslinging, and even less doubt about the outcome in elections where there's no competition. That's because there are as many candidates as seats to be filled.
Is this even real life? She's just cheerleading these phony elections?
All of them by supporters of the communist government. A system President Castro boasts is the most democratic and cleanest in the world.
Oh, well, if he says so, who's to argue with the man while he's boasting?
In Santiago, as all over Cuba, the turnout was high in this country where voting is not mandatory, but expected.
It's not mandatory, but it's expected? Oh, that doesn't sound sinister at all.
Polling facilities were provided even in hospitals to ensure the sick could vote.
Aw, how sweet of them. You wouldn't want sick people to miss out on forced compliance.
There is in Cuba government intrusion into everyone's life from the moment he is born until the day he dies. The reasoning is that the government wants to better the lives of its citizens and keep them from exploiting or hurting one another.
And you find that reasoning compelling? How do you say that with a straight face?
On a sunny day in a park in the old city of Havana, it is difficult to see anything that is sinister.
Well, why don't you ask them if they have anything negative to say about Fidel? Go ahead. Surely they'll have no problem speaking openly.
But while Fidel Castro, and certainly justified on his record, is widely criticized for a lot of things, there is no question that Castro feels a very deep and abiding connection with those Cubans who are still in Cuba. And I recognize this might be controversial, but there's little doubt in my mind that Fidel Castro was sincere when he said, listen, we really want this child back here.
Oh, well, as long as the slave master sincerely wants his slave returned, then by all means, send him back. Who are we to play Harriet Tubman with a Cuban refugee?
Frankly, to be a poor child in Cuba may, in many instances, be better than being a poor child in Miami. And I'm going to condemn their lifestyles so gratuitously.
Maybe they have a point, you might say. Maybe he wasn't so bad. You haven't really proven anything. You've just played a few clips and made some sarcastic remarks. Who are you, Jon Stewart? Well, fair enough. But what would convince you? I mean, maybe you weren't turned off by censorship, or by nationalization of private property, or even by single-party rule. But you have to at least draw the line at extrajudicial killings, right? Surely nobody would support anybody who executed thousands of people without a trial. Would they? Well, the Cuba Archive has documented over 8,000 confirmed deaths directly at the hands of the Castro regime, mostly in the form of firing squad executions. All such executions are either done without trial or done with a phony show trial, since Che Guevara believed that judicial evidence is an archaic and secondary bourgeois detail. This is a revolution. We execute from revolutionary conviction. The Black Book of Communism estimates the actual number to be roughly double that. And University of Hawaii professor R.J. Rummel estimated the likely overall death toll of the Castro regime to be much higher, between 35,000 and 141,000. This number is much higher because it includes the death of Cubans who have died trying to escape the island on rafts. Estimates for the number of Cubans who have died trying to make it to Florida on a raft range from 77,000 to upwards of 100,000 based on the method used. That is a lot of people. I mean, can you imagine what their life must have been like to pile their families onto a raft and take their slim chances with a raft on the open sea? Well, it turns out you don't have to imagine it because it has been thoroughly documented by Cubans that suffered through it and lived to tell their story. For instance, Armando Valladares, who was imprisoned in Cuba for 22 years after refusing to display a communist slogan on his work desk. In his memoir, Against All Hope, Valladares describes torture, starvation, forced labor, rape, biological experiments, and an overall experience of terror. To what end, you might ask? Valladares tells us, "They didn't try to kill us quickly. That would have been too generous a gesture to have hoped from those sadists. Their object was to force us, by means of terror and torture, into the political rehabilitation program. To do that, they were slowly and inexorably destroying us. They would take us to the very brink of death and keep us there without letting us cross it. We had been vaccinated against tetanus, so they could bayonet us, wound us with machetes and iron bars, and break our skulls, sure that at least we wouldn't contract tetanus. But men could not stand up forever to the daily beatings, the terror, the psychological tortures, and some took on the uniform," meaning they joined the Communist Party and went over to the other side. "These desertions caused us great pain. It was as if the authorities were pulling off pieces of our own bodies. I felt diminished every time one of our men left. Years of terror, misery, and the dream of freedom had united us." And that's just one prisoner among tens of thousands. Freedom House estimates as many as 500,000 Cubans passed through Castro's gulag since 1959. Oh, and then there was the time, less than a month after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Castro sent agents on a mission of terror to detonate 500 kilograms of TNT in, among other places, Macy's, Gimbel's, Bloomingdale's, and Grand Central Station on Black Friday. Fortunately, the FBI was able to foil that plot. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Before I made my case against Castro, I posed the question, what would convince you? In other words, what is the threshold of evidence that would squash any notion that Fidel Castro maintained any shred of benevolence? Now, some of you will have watched this video and you'll be convinced. But I assure you that many viewers, even after watching this video, even after learning whatever they can learn, will still cling to their belief that Fidel Castro had some virtues or that socialism isn't unequivocally evil. After all, I haven't presented any information that isn't widely available to anybody with an internet connection. I'm not exactly Heinrich Schliemann uncovering the lost city of Troy. But that makes the pro-Castro mindset even more egregious, or the pro-socialism mindset even more egregious, because they know all this stuff. This information is available, and they still pay him homage. They still pay lip service to socialism. And there's no shortage of people more than willing to sweep atrocity after atrocity under the rug and mindlessly hold on to the sentiment of free healthcare, education, healthcare, free healthcare. But what if I were to expose the Cuban healthcare system for the fraud that it is and reveal the abject repugnance of the so-called utopian great healthcare system that they have in Cuba?
Health and education are the revolution's great success stories.
By then a declared socialist, he dramatically improved health care.
Some of Cuba's health care is world class.
Another success Cubans point to, health care.
And the level of public services was remarkable.
Even Castro's critics praised his advances in healthcare.
Cuban medicine is renowned the world over.
They forgot that he educated their kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society.
How about now? Now, admittedly, a few photos smuggled out of Cuba of a hospital that's run down doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, perhaps. But I've actually linked, or not linked, but I have a playlist of several other YouTube videos that show footage, that show video footage of what it's like in Cuban hospitals, and I really would advise you to check those out if you have any doubt remaining about the veracity of any claims that I've made about the Cuban so-called healthcare, the so-called great healthcare system. It's not true. But even then, you might say, well, this is just raw footage. There's not enough context. I don't know if this is representative of the whole system. Well, what if I were to tell you the story of Catherine Hirschfeld, who went to Cuba she was going there actually trying to find evidence she was a supporter of, she believed in the Cuban system, and she was looking for evidence, and she wanted to document their achievements. And she found herself in the midst of an outbreak of dengue fever, the existence of which no doctor or government official would even admit, despite the tens of thousands of clear-cut cases, leaving her, and here's an understatement, skeptical of official Cuban government communiques regarding healthcare. You think? You shouldn't believe anything that the Castro regime reports any more than you would believe Kim Jong-un if he said he jumped over the moon. Would that suffice as conclusive? The answer is no. And for an explanation of that, I turn to a timeless essay written by Ayn Rand in 1962 called The Monument Builders. An eloquent sign of the moral corruption of our age is the callous complacency with which most of the socialists and their sympathizers, the liberals, regard the atrocities perpetuated in socialistic countries and accept rule by terror as a way of life while posturing as advocates of human brotherhood. In the 1930s, they did protest against the atrocities of Nazi Germany, but apparently it was not an issue of principle, but only the protest of a rival gang fighting for the same territory, because we do not hear their voices any longer. In the name of humanity, they condone and accept the following: the abolition of all freedom and all rights, the expropriation of all property, executions without trial, torture chambers, slave labor camps, the mass slaughter of countless millions in Soviet Russia, and the bloody horror of East Berlin, including the bullet-ridden bodies of fleeing children. When one observes the nightmare of the desperate efforts made by hundreds of thousands of people struggling to escape from the socialized countries of Europe, to escape over barbed wire fences under machine gun fire, one can no longer believe that socialism, in any of its forms, is motivated by benevolence and by the desire to achieve men's welfare. No man of authentic benevolence could evade or ignore so great a horror on so vast a scale. As uncomfortable as it might be to accept, it's very difficult to argue with that. And if it's true, then what follows? For that, I turn to Peter Schwartz. Evil is not self-sustaining. That which stands defiantly opposed to reality cannot survive on its own. Its enduring existence requires the acquiescence of the good. Existentially, the irrational survives parasitically by feeding off the rational. Intellectually, an irrational idea gains influence fraudulently by covering itself with a veneer of rationality. The practice of Marxism, for example, gains material sustenance from the productive free world. The theory of Marxism gains acceptance by declaring that it seeks to eradicate unfair exploitation, not that it desires to impose totalitarian enslavement. The weapon necessary to defend against evil is justice, the unequivocal identification of evil as evil. This means the refusal to grant it, by word or by deed, any moral respectability. It is by scrupulously withholding from the irrational even a crumb of a moral sanction, by rejecting any form of accommodation with the irrational, by forcing the irrational to stand naked and unaided, that one keeps evil impotent. What do you think? Do you agree with that? Well, one thing's for certain, and that's that Che Guevara did. A foreign reporter, preferably American, was much more valuable to us at that time than any military victory. Much more valuable than rural recruits for our guerrilla force were American media recruits to export our propaganda. So, here's what I'm saying. It is not just those who commit acts of evil who pose a threat and deserve to be morally condemned. It is also the supporters of evil, the appeasers of evil, the apologists for evil, the lukewarm condoners of evil, the pardoners of evil, and even those who are complacent in the face of evil that permit evil to thrive. Do you agree? What do you think? Alright guys, thanks for watching my first video. Stay tuned for more, and be sure to share and comment below. I'll see you next time.